Hello. We're going to be in 1 Samuel today. We're going to be looking at the rise of David. This is probably the lowest point in all of these early years of David. He's really gone to make a mistake, and a lot of people are going to pay the price with their life. Chapters 21 and 22 form a unit of David fleeing from Saul after the covenant of friendship between Jonathan and David. The continuing paranoia, schizophrenia, manic depressiveness of Saul is going to lead to the destruction of some people who inadvertently helped David because David lied to him. Let's look, if we could then, at chapter 21, verse 1. Then David came to Nob. Now, Nob apparently is a Levitical city in the Benjamite territorial region. It's about maybe 2 miles north of Jerusalem. You can see the city from where this is, and this apparently where Nob is. To Elimelech the priest. Now, this is one of the descendants of Eli. Apparently, this is where the tabernacle's accoutrements moved to when Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is not here, but the other pieces of furniture, like the table of showbread and maybe even the candelabra, the menorah, that is probably here. There's a large group of priests here of the family of Eli. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David. Why? Well, it's kind of what the elders did to Samuel at Bethlehem. Apparently, something of this tension between David and Saul was known, or maybe when he saw David by himself and unarmed, he thought something terrible had happened, and the boy had pretty good premonition. And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter, and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, and with which I have commissioned you." Now that's pure bull. He's just making that up. It's really going to cause a problem. I don't know why David's having to lie. Maybe he thinks the priest won't help him if he doesn't lie. I don't know. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, these young men are going to be the source of discussion. Are they imaginary? Is this just part of the lie? Or is there some group of people with David? Or is David himself going to lie about getting this bread and then eat it all for himself? I just don't know. It's a pretty shabby deal here. I don't think God was pleased with the way David was doing this. Now, therefore, what do you have in hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there is no ordinary bread on hand. Now, some have said that's an example that the priest didn't have any food. They were in a time of disrepute, but we really don't know that. Bread was cooked in the morning. It was usually eaten and not kept, although it is true that bread is sometimes made in such a way in the ancient Near East that would last several days. It was hard bread, not fresh bread. But there is the bread of the presence. That's what the priest would normally eat. There was 85 priests here. Maybe that's all the bread they used. And it said there is the consecrated bread. Now, in verse 6, it's called the bread of the presence. If you remember the tabernacle, there was the table of showbread. And on this table, a large loaf, I mean a big loaf, I forgot what it is, I think it's 5 pounds plus, for each of the tribes. It was a way of showing God's provision. It wasn't food for God, but a way of showing God's provision for the tribes. You might want to see Leviticus 24, 5 through 9 is where it's talked about, and it's described in Exodus 25:30. So how they made it and how they did it and how they used it are the two different things. This is even mentioned by Jesus in Mark 2:25 and 26. It was a bread for the priest only, but in a time like this, the priest was willing to share it. And so that shows something about the non-legalistic nature of some of these laws. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. Now, I think these are imaginary young men. But anyway, here's a discussion. The priest is worried about this holy bread going to unholy men. Now, I've got 2 or 3 comments about this. The first one is, this is the Hebrew view. Not that sex is evil and that if you have sex means you're not holy. No. Any kind of bodily emissions, and of course sexual intercourse would involve bodily emissions, made someone ceremonially unclean. You might want to see Leviticus 12 through 15. And I think the places that are most applicable are chapter 12 and 15, but that whole section deals with this. We learn from other ancient historical documents that the Semites, a larger group than Hebrews, but included the Hebrews, when they sent their men out to war, they had to abstain from any kind of sexual intercourse because they were holy, to go to the battle holy. And that these young men would have been, of course, on military maneuvers, and they would expect it to have abstained from any kind of sexual intercourse. You might want to see 2 Samuel 11, 6 through 13. You might want to see Joshua 3:5. We found the same thing in the Qumran literature, particularly the War Scroll describes this same thing. And also in the book of the Revelation, chapter 14, verse 4. You might want to see that for another allusion to this. Now this abstaining from the normal parts of married life was seen as a part of a purification ritual. You might want to see Exodus 19:15. But it's not a disparaging comment on sexuality. It's their view of what made someone ceremonially clean or ceremonially unclean. Now, and David answered the priest and said, "Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men are holy." Now, what are these vessels of the young men? Well, some say it's their weapons, and the etymology in the Hebrew could imply that. Others say it's their clothes. Others say, no, it's their food bags, their knapsacks. Others say, no, it's their mess kits. Others say, no, it's their bodies, or a euphemism for the male genitals. Obviously, we don't know. The Hebrew word's rather rare. As though it were an ordinary journey, how much more than today will their vessels be holy, meaning this special military thing that Saul sent him on, which was all baloney to start out with. So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord in order to put the hot bread in its place when it was taken away. So it's obviously close to the Sabbath here. Now, one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. Well, there has been a million theories about what it means to be detained before the Lord, because we don't have an example of this anywhere else in the Bible. Here are the theories. He was waiting for an answer, meaning he asked the priest a question and was waiting for God to answer. Number two, the etymology of the Hebrew term may come from holiday. He was spending a holiday there, a day of rest. Number three, it was a punishment, some kind of judicial thing. He had to stay there a while. Some say he was assigned a specific task. He's going to be the head of Saul's shepherds. Maybe he was involved in bringing certain kinds of ritual animals there to be sacrificed and had to wait for some reason. Some say he was paying a vow and had to wait till the Sabbath. Some say he was unclean and had to perform a certain ritual. Others say no, he had to be examined by the priest and had to wait a certain amount of days. Obviously, we don't know why he was detained there, but he was. And his name was Doeg, the Edomite. Now, Edomites, we see from Deuteronomy 23:8, were not condemned. Along with Egyptians, they were allowed in the congregation of Israel. He was the chief of Saul's shepherds. Although later on, he's going to be, I was looking over here, chapter 22, verse 17, he seems to be called a runner, and there's a possibility the Hebrew words are close, and maybe that's what he was, a runner, as well as the chief shepherd. Now, and David said to Ahimelech, "Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent." Well, lo and behold, there is going to be a weapon there, and it's going to be Goliath, the Philistine giant that David killed. Remember, back in chapter 17, verse 54, it said David put it in his tent at Jerusalem. Well, this is very close to Jerusalem. Maybe this is the tent they were speaking of there, because here it's mentioned here, and it says that behold, is wrapped in a cloth, maybe Goliath's cape, I don't know, behind the ephod. Now that sounds funny, because the ephod is the priestly vest to which the breastplate was attached. Matter of fact, this word has been used in 3 different ways in the Bible. Really caused us the miseries of trying to lock it down. Number one, it's the linen robe that all priests wear. You might want to see 1 Samuel 2:18, for where Samuel wore one, and 22:18, where all these descendants of Eli wore these linen ephods. It also can mean the special dress of the high priest, a kind of a coat of mail to which this breastplate was attached. And if that's true, you might want to see Exodus 29:5, Leviticus 8:7. The thing is described in detail in Exodus 28, verses 6 through 14, and Exodus 39, verses 2 through 31, I believe. Now, but some say it was an idol of some kind. It's spoken of in strange ways to be a piece of clothing. There was one made by Micah in Judges chapter 17:5, Judges 18:14, 17, and 20. It's also one made by Gideon, Judges 8:27. These things seem to be portable. They were brought in and took out and all that. 1 Samuel 2:28, 1 Samuel 14:3, 1 Samuel 23:6, 9, 1 Samuel 30 verse 7, and they're used to consult God. 1 Samuel 23:10 and 1 Samuel 30 verse 8. So we're not exactly sure what this ephod was. Notice in verses 10 through 15, David went to the Philistines to run from Saul. You talk about out of the frying pan into the fire. That's exactly what he did. He got there, and the servants recognized him and told the king, "This is David. He's the king of Israel, king of the people of the land." He really wasn't, but he was. They mentioned the songs that were sung about him. He's the one that killed their giant. He's the one that caused them the miseries. Now, some people say that because of 2 or 3 of these Hebrew words, maybe that David went there to hide and wanted to be incognito, but they caught him and brought him before the king, and we're not really sure why David was there. But look what he does in verse 13. This is not very noble. So he disguised his sanity before them. Look what he did. 3 things. He acted insanely in their hands. He scribbled on the door of the gate, and he let saliva run down his beard. Yuck. Well, it's going to work. 14 and 15, the king says, "I've got enough crazy men in my own city. I don't need to add this guy. Get him out of here." And some say maybe that happened before they really found out who he was, but I'm not sure. He got away, and surprising, because in chapter 27 he's going to come right back to this same Philistine city. Many people wonder about the connection between these 2 chapters, and I simply don't know. Now 22, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now this cave of Deulim is interesting. It's in an area about 16 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's not too far from the very site where Goliath was killed. It's an area of deep ravines and caves and those kinds of geographical areas, and was used for hiding many times. And apparently this cave of Adullam is a major hideout of David. Now there's the 4 different kind of folks who started gathering themselves around David. Number 1, in verse 1, all his family's household, the men of his father's house, his brothers and their families and all that. Number 2, anyone who was in distress. Number 3, anyone who was in debt. Number 4, anyone who was discontented. Was kind of the grumpy, gripey paupers. It was a ragtag group. David's going to kind of whip them into an army. They'll form the core of his later military machine. But notice it started with those who were just disgruntled with Saul. And David went from there to Mitzpah of Moab. Now he's going to go to the king of Moab and ask if Jesse and his mother can stay there, daddy and mother. Why would he go to Moab? Well, maybe because Moab was mad at Saul. We learn from chapter 14, verse 47. He killed a bunch of them. And any enemy of Saul was a friend of Moab. Maybe that's it. But really, in reality, it's probably the fact that David is a descendant of Ruth the Moabitess. They would know that, and that would make him welcome at court. Let me see if I can find that. Well, it's in Luke, in the book of Ruth. So the rabbis say that this Moabite king, after David left, killed Jesse and his mother, and this is why David acted so cruelly to them when he became king in 2 Samuel 8:2 and 1 Chronicles 18:2. Well, we don't know why David was cruel against the Moabites again, but that's the rabbinical tradition. Now, verse 5, and the prophet Gad. Now, this is the first time we mention him. He's going to be one of those folks that help us record David's early life. We learn from 1 Chronicles 29:29. He's later at David's court, one of the court prophets, 2 Samuel 24:11 through 14, 18, and 19. But Nathan was the chief prophet at court. Gad gave some kind of religious credibility to this ragtag group, I guarantee you. Said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah." Well, I thought Adullam was in the land of Judah. Well, is the stronghold of verse 4 and the cave of verse 1 synonymous? Well, if they are, it can't be, because he's already in the land of Judah. These two seem to be linked together, Adullam, the cave of Adullam, and the fortress, in 2 Samuel 23:13 and 14, and 1 Chronicles, I left out the chapter. You have to look in your reference Bible and get the parallel. Others say they're 2 different places, but they seem to be the same thing. Maybe it was on the borderline of the Philistine area, and it was considered Philistine territory, not Judah, and the prophet's saying go deeper into Judah's territory away from the Philistine boundary. Maybe that's it. We're just not sure. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul's really getting paranoid now. David's not only escaped, but he's got 400 soldiers with him. Now Saul was sitting at Gibeah, that's of course his home site, under the tamarisk tree. We've noted how that's interesting, that these trees became special sites of people judging and sitting in court like that. On the height of his spear. Now, his spear seemed to be the symbol of his authority, the symbol of his kingship. You might want to check in 1 Samuel 26:11 to see that. And Saul's angry as he can be. Notice it says, and Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Now hear, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give you fields and vineyards?" Well, this is kind of playing to their personal interests. He's saying, you better support me. If David becomes king, you're out on your ears. All this land I've given you, you have to give back. Your fancy salaries are going to be gone. You better serve me out of self-interest, friend, and be sure that David doesn't do that. That's kind of his line of reasoning. In verse 8, he's even griping because Jonathan made a covenant with Jesse, the son of Jesse. You might want to see 1 Samuel 18, verse 3, and 1 Samuel 20, verse 8 and 16. It was kind of a friendship pact, but Saul is just furious. His own family, Michal his daughter, Jonathan his son, are both helping David, and it just adds to his mental problems. So he's mentioning all this to his soldiers, and he wants to know where David is, and no one will tell him. Look at verse 9. Then Doeg, the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And look at verse 10. Here's what supposedly this priest did for David. Number 1, he inquired of the Lord for him. We have no record of that back in chapter 21. Number 2, he gave him provisions. That's the bread. Number 3, he gave him the sword of Goliath, and that's true. The last two are for sure true. The first one may just be his assumption, but it may have been that David also got a word from the Lord there too. Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. Now, they're going to stand there, and the king says, how could you be so disloyal to me? How could you do this to David? Listen what the man's answer is. I think it's pretty good. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants, number 1, is as faithful as David? Number 2, even is the king's son-in-law. Number 3, who is captain over your guard. Number 4, is honored in your house. Ahimelech saying, how am I supposed to know that David wasn't telling the truth? He's one of your honored, loyal, faithful servants, Saul. Am I supposed to be able to read his mind? The Lord didn't tell me. He lied to me. Now why are you accusing me? Well, that's pretty good answer. How could Saul be upset about that? Well, he's going to be so upset. What's that? Did I just begin to inquire of the Lord for him today? Apparently he's saying, he's come several times for you, and I've asked the Lord for him. Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. Well, that's true. But the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. Saul he's already cut himself off from the prophet Samuel. Now he's going to cut himself off from the priest by killing the high priest family. Isn't that amazing? The king said to his guards. Now there's the word runners, but the king had these all kind of different officials with him. These young men would run from place to place and bring messages and take messages. Here it's kind of like guards or officials who were attending him. Turn around and put the priest of the Lord to death. Well, those Israelites wouldn't kill those priests. But Doeg is there. Apparently, I don't know what he was doing at the sanctuary, but he wasn't worshiping, apparently, because he has no qualm in killing these priests. He didn't know Yahweh too well. You turn around and attack the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priest. And he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Now, some have said that this is part of the judgment that Samuel predicted against the house of Eli back in chapter 2, verses 27 through 30. And that seems true. 85 men. Did Doeg kill all 85 men by himself? Well, some say he had his own servants with him, and that may be true. We just don't know. He struck Nob, the city of the priest, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkey, sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. Verse 19. Folks, that's holy war. You do that to the Amalekites. You don't do that to your own people. Saul, and apparently through Doeg and his men, went to the home of these priests and killed everybody. Everything that breathed died, including their animals and all their family. Holy war against the people of God. Oh, But one of the sons of Ahimelech, a son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar is going to be a very interesting person. He's going to share the priesthood with Zadok during the reign of David. We can see that in 2 Samuel 8:17, 2 Samuel 17:15, 2 Samuel 19:12, and 2 Samuel 20:25. Very important person. Number two, he sided with Adonijah in the succession wars with Solomon. 1 Kings 1:7, chapter 1, verse 7, verse 19, verse 25, and chapter 2, verse 22. And then when Solomon became king, Solomon banished him to the city of Anathoth. 1 Kings 2:26 and 27. Abiathar is going to be the priestly family that's excluded from the temple from which Jeremiah will come, the city of Anathoth. So he is a very important person. Notice that Saul has cut himself off again. He tries to do things and he just messes up so bad. Now David has 400 soldiers. He's got the prophet Gad, and he's got the legitimate high priest Abiathar. Saul has no word from God, no way to know. That's why later on he's going to call up the witch of Endor, try to get a word from God. He did it to himself. The man is just, it's not that he's irreligious, he's just dumb about religious matters, and his mental illness causes him to do irrational, hostile, angry, destructive acts. It's really sad. Let's see. I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. David admits it was his fault. Why did David lie? He didn't have to. Maybe he thought he did. But by lying, he caused the death of this priest. He caused the death of this priestly family. You say, yes, but it was God's prophecy that this family die. That's true. Going back to chapter 2, 28 through 30. But I don't think it was God's will through David lying about it. Just because God knows it's going to happen doesn't mean he condones the way it happened. You know, I get so amazed. People say, well, the Bible says, folks, the Bible records a whole lot of things the Bible doesn't advocate. It's interesting to me that in Islam, you're allowed to lie for religious reasons, to save yourself or whatever. They get that from the Old Testament. Here's David doing that. Just because David does it, just because others do it, doesn't mean it's right. The Bible records many things that it does not advocate. You need to remember that. Like plural marriages. You can't say, well, they had plural marriage, so no, you can't do that. David lied for religious reasons, so I can lie. No, you can't do that. Sorry. Verse 23. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. You shall be safe with me. Now here again, we see David trying to make up for the wrong he did. I'm sure David grieved over this, was sorry about this. This terrible evil is never attributed to Saul. The problem is Saul's already blown it. He blew it by offering sacrifice, and his children were rejected from succeeding him. Then he didn't wait for Samuel to offer sacrifice, and he's rejected as king. He's done so much evil, he's already going to die in his sin. This sin is not even mentioned anymore to Saul. But David, I think, carries some responsibility for this. I think we need to realize that not only is sin something we do, but our sin affects many others. David's going to learn this the hard way. David's lie cost the life of 85 priests and all their families. And he admits it here to the one man left. I'm sorry. All this happened because of me. Saul did it. Doeg did it. But David's the one that caused the problem. And so I think you can see that. Well, we've been looking at the life of David now as Saul continues to decline, both religiously, intellectually, morally. We see it just plummeting. We see David rising, but it wasn't a rise that was totally ethical. He did some really dumb things. Went to the Philistines and almost got killed. Had to play crazy, my goodness. Lied about running when he didn't have to. Got a pretty rough band of thugs with him and used them. He was a thief and a marauder in his early days. So God is with him. So we can't judge it in our ethics and our morality. It's a rise to power, But it's a pretty shabby rise in some areas. And I must admit to you, 21 and 22 is probably the lowest moral point of the rise of David to be king of the people of God. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God be with you.